couple of weeks ago, I had a strange experience at Walmart. It was around 8 p.m. when I decided to stop by for a few items. As I entered the store, everything seemed pretty normal. Not too crowded, but not empty either. Without wasting time, I headed to the right side of the store to grab some soap, which was the first thing on my list. While walking, I noticed a man coming from the opposite direction. He was wearing a shirt that said, "Human Mammal." I distinctly remember reading that, but I didn't think much of it and continued on my way. After picking up the soap, I moved toward the back of the store to get the remaining items. It took me a little over 5 minutes to gather everything. On my way back to the front, I noticed the store had become quieter in that particular section. However, one person caught my eye. It was the same man from earlier. He was standing in a random aisle, pushing items off the shelves as if he was intentionally trying to make a mess. The man had slightly long dark hair, a stocky build, and was a little under 6 feet tall. I couldn't help but stare for a moment. At first, I thought about walking past him. But as I got closer, I decided to stop. The man glanced at me while continuing to knock things onto the floor. Out of curiosity, I asked what he was doing. My tone wasn't confrontational. I was genuinely interested. He looked at me briefly but didn't stop what he was doing or respond. Instead, he turned away and ignored me completely. Looking around, I didn't see any employees nearby. When I turned back to him, he raised his middle finger at me. I considered saying something but decided against it. Surely, someone else would notice his behavior soon, and he'd face consequences. I walked toward the self-checkout area, paid for my items, and prepared to leave. As I exited the store and headed to the parking lot, I glanced back and saw the same man about 50 feet behind me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence that he was leaving at the same time, but something about the way he was looking at me felt off. I brushed it off, reached my car, unlocked it, and got inside. I wasn't in a hurry, so I started the engine and got ready to back out. That's when I noticed him again. The human mammal guy was standing directly behind my car, staring at me through the rear window. I waited for about a minute, but he didn't budge. I rolled down my window and shouted, asking him to move. He ignored me completely and remained still with a blank expression. Frustrated, I honked the horn, but he still didn't react. Unsure of what else to do, I turned off my engine and stepped out of the car. At first, the man didn't move at all. I asked him what his problem was, but once again, he ignored me. Feeling uneasy, I decided not to confront him further. Instead, I walked back toward the Walmart entrance, hoping to find help. The man calmly followed me through the parking lot, maintaining a distance of about 10 feet. By the time I reached the doors, he was still right behind me. Once inside, I spotted a group of employees near the self-checkout area. As I walked past them, the man continued trailing me. One of the employees noticed him and approached. When the man tried to walk past, another employee blocked his path. I overheard them confronting him about throwing items off the shelves. It seemed like someone had reported him or he'd been caught on camera. Using this distraction to my advantage, I slipped away and exited the store. This time, the man couldn't follow me. I got in my car and left, relieved to be done with the whole ordeal. I haven't seen him since, and I hope he was banned from the store. His behavior was bizarre and seemed like he was just trying to stir up trouble. Story 2. When I was 16, I got my first job at Walmart. The store was only about a 10-minute drive from my parents' house, where I lived at the time. I was still in high school and would usually work after school or on weekends. Since I didn't have a car yet, my parents would drop me off and pick me up from work. My goal was to save enough money from this job to eventually buy my own car. A couple of months into working there, I had an evening shift. I started at 4 p.m. after school and was scheduled to finish at 9 p.m. I worked as a cashier, spending my entire shift at the check lanes. It was a typical evening, nothing unusual. The store wasn't very busy except for a couple of hours when there was a small rush. Other than that, it was fairly quiet. That night, my manager let me clock out early since it wasn't busy. Around 8:45, I went to the employees-only area to clock out, and then texted my mom to let her know I was done for the night. She replied quickly, saying she was on her way to pick me up. I walked out of the store and sat on one of the benches near the entrance, which faced the parking lot. There were a few small trees and plants scattered around the area. This was my usual spot to wait for my mom if she wasn't there already. I sat down and passed the time on my phone. The parking lot was relatively quiet at this hour, though occasional customers were still coming and going. The lot wasn't empty because of the employees' cars and a few remaining shoppers. While waiting, I noticed an older, large SUV entering the parking lot. It drove around slowly and passed in front of the store's entrance, which was a little to my left. Then it turned and headed back through the lot. I didn't pay much attention to it and went back to scrolling on my phone. A couple of minutes later, I looked up and saw the same SUV again. It seemed like it was circling the parking lot. This time, the car moved even slower, and as it approached the front of the store, it stopped right in front of me. I started to feel uneasy, though I wasn't sure why. The SUV wasn't my mom's car, so I didn't understand why it had stopped. The passenger side window rolled down, and I could see the driver, a man, looking directly at me. He called out, asking if I needed a ride. He offered to take me home or wherever I needed to go. I quickly shook my head and told him no. The man had dark, somewhat long hair and was wearing a baseball cap. Despite my refusal, he insisted that I should get in his car and motioned for me to come over. I repeated my refusal, but the man didn't drive away. For a moment, he just sat there, and I thought he might finally leave. But suddenly, the driver's door opened, and he stepped out. My heart raced as I watched him walk around the car. He moved quickly, heading straight toward me. Without wasting another second, I jumped up from the bench and ran to the Walmart entrance. I didn't look back until I was safely inside. Once inside, I glanced behind me and saw that the man hadn't followed me into the store. I couldn't see him right outside either, so I assumed he had gone back to his car. Feeling shaken, I decided to stay inside the store and sat on a bench near the front. I waited there until my mom texted me about 5 minutes later, letting me know she had arrived. When I went back outside, I immediately spotted my mom's car. I quickly got in, feeling a wave of relief. I explained to her what had happened and we looked around the parking lot together. That's when I saw the same SUV again. This time it was parked in a spot with its engine running. We didn't stick around to investigate further and left the parking lot. Thankfully, we weren't followed. When I got home, I called my manager to report the incident. I don't know if the man ever returned to the store, but for the rest of the time I worked there, I never saw him again. Thankfully, nothing like that ever happened to me again. Story 3. I'm a female and live near several Walmart stores, but there's one I usually visit since it's the closest to my home. On average, I'd say I went there about once a week for groceries and other essentials, as the prices were much lower compared to other stores. One evening around 8 p.m., I went to Walmart to grab a few items. The store was pretty quiet, which made it easy to notice that someone seemed to be following me. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but I realized after walking through 4 different aisles that the same person was trailing behind me. When I turned around, I saw it was a Walmart employee. He was short, had dark brown hair, glasses, and wore the store's vest. When I stopped and looked at him, he also paused. I turned back and kept walking, but shortly after I noticed him again. It was clear that he was deliberately following me, but I had no idea why. To see if it was really intentional, I went to a completely different aisle far from where I had been. Sure enough, he followed me, staying about 30 feet behind. Once I entered the aisle, he stopped at the end, pretending to look at items on the shelves. It was as if he was trying to make it seem like he was working. At this point, I couldn't ignore it any longer, so I decided to confront him. I walked up to him and asked directly, "Is there a reason you're following me around the store?" He looked startled and denied it, claiming he didn't know what I was talking about. I pointed out how he had been in every aisle I visited for at least the last 5 minutes, but he brushed it off, saying it was just a coincidence and that he was always moving around the store. I shook my head and walked away. After that, he didn't follow me again during that visit. I assumed confronting him was enough to make him stop. I didn't feel the need to report him, so I finished my shopping and left the store without seeing him again. I thought that would be the end of it, but when I returned to the same Walmart about a week later, the same thing happened. This time, he was more subtle, keeping a greater distance, but I could still tell he was following me. Not long after I entered the store, I noticed him across the way in another aisle. Hoping he hadn't spotted me, I moved to a different section, but not long after, I saw him again, this time closer. When I moved to yet another aisle, he was standing at the end of it, watching. Feeling creeped out, I decided to leave without buying anything. Thankfully, he didn't follow me out of the store. After that experience, I considered avoiding that Walmart altogether. The next time I needed to shop, I went to a different store. However, several weeks later, I must have forgotten about the incident because I ended up going back to the same Walmart. I hoped for a normal shopping trip and wasn't thinking about the guy until I saw him again about 5 minutes after entering. He was walking about 20 feet away from me, and the moment I recognized him, I decided to leave immediately. As I turned to head for the exit, I noticed him following me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw he was walking about 20 feet behind me. I made my way to the doors and exited, but to my shock, he walked right out of the store after me. By the time I had crossed about 10 feet into the parking lot, he was still following me. That's when I decided to run. I sprinted to my car, unlocked it, and quickly got inside. Once inside, I looked around but couldn't see him anymore. He could have been hiding behind one of the nearby cars, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I drove away and went to a different store. After that, I decided I wouldn't return to that Walmart. I did call the store to report what happened, but I'm not sure how they handled it. To this day, I don't know what the man's intentions were or why he kept following me. I even wondered if he actually worked there, or was just wearing the vest to look like an employee. However, I do think he was a real employee because he seemed to be moving around like he was on duty. Regardless, when he followed me out of the store, it caught me completely off guard. I hope I never see him again. Story 4. I used to work at Walmart for about 6 months, primarily stocking shelves. I often worked in the clothing section, but sometimes covered other areas, and my shifts were typically overnight. My schedule usually started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The store closed at 11 p.m., so for the first hour, I'd work with customers in the store, though there were rarely many at that time. Our Walmart was one of the quieter ones, and we were often understaffed, even compared to other locations. One night, I arrived at work around 10 p.m. and began stocking shelves in the grocery section. At about midnight, I was working alone in one of the back aisles. Everything was quiet until I suddenly heard something fall from a shelf in the next aisle over. It sounded like it came from the top shelf, which was odd. I stopped what I was doing to check it out, assuming another coworker might be nearby. But when I walked around the corner to the other aisle, I didn't see anyone there. Shrugging it off, I went back to work. About 10 minutes later, I caught a glimpse of someone passing by my aisle. It was only for a second, but I could tell it wasn't a coworker. They weren't wearing a uniform. Curious, I walked over to see who it was. I turned the corner just in time to see the person disappearing into another aisle. I called out to ask who was there, but no one responded. Determined to find out what was going on, I followed and entered the aisle where the person had gone. To my surprise, I didn't see anyone at first. It was strange because I hadn't heard them leave. After looking more closely, I spotted him. He was crouching on the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind some boxes. I could just barely see his head poking out between the items. It was such a bizarre sight that I froze for a moment. In hindsight, I should have gone straight to my boss, but instead, I called out to the man asking what he was doing. He didn't respond or move, even though it was clear I had seen him. I told him the store was closed and that he needed to leave. He still didn't react, staying hidden where he was. At that point, I decided to find my boss. I walked a fair distance to let my boss know what was happening. Together, we returned to the aisle, but as we arrived, we saw the man sprinting away. He ran out of the aisle and disappeared before we could catch him. We briefly tried to follow his path, but he was moving too fast. My boss assured me that the situation would be handled and told me to get back to work. I overheard him radioing someone else as I returned to stocking shelves. feeling a little more at ease. For the next hour and a half, everything seemed normal again. I was working alone in another section when I suddenly heard someone approaching. Expecting to see a coworker, I turned around, but to my shock, it was the same man. I couldn't believe he was still in the store. My boss had said it would be taken care of, but somehow he hadn't been removed. The sight of him startled me, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The man started chasing me through the aisles. I ran as fast as I could, passing several aisles before finally finding another coworker. When the coworker saw what was happening, the man changed direction and ran off into another part of the store. My coworker and I quickly moved away from him, heading in the opposite direction. The police were called, and all of the employees were evacuated from the store. When the officers arrived, they searched the building and found the man after about 10 minutes. It was unsettling to learn that he had been hiding in the store for hours, moving around to avoid detection. Even after the store had closed, no one had been able to get him to leave. I have no idea what his intentions were, or why he approached me specifically, but the whole situation was deeply unsettling. I'm just glad that he was eventually caught, and I hope I never encounter anything like that again. Story 5. Not too long ago, I had a strange experience after shopping at Walmart. It started off as a regular afternoon, and I was doing my grocery shopping at the Walmart located about 10 minutes from my house. The store was fairly busy, with plenty of people shopping. I spent about half an hour inside and was in one of the grocery aisles when a man struck up a conversation with me. The man was around 5 feet 8 inches, bald, and wore glasses. He greeted me and asked what I was shopping for, which I found a little odd since he didn't work there. And it's not common for strangers to start conversations like that. His tone was friendly, but something about it felt slightly off. I responded that I was just picking up groceries and was almost done. He kept talking and asked if I was heading home after shopping, which struck me as a strange question. I answered yes, and then he mentioned that he still had a lot of shopping to do and listed several things he planned to buy. I figured he was just being overly friendly and didn't think much of it, even though the interaction felt slightly awkward. After a couple of minutes, I told him I needed to grab one last item and head to the checkout. I said goodbye, and he replied with a goodbye as well, walking off in a different direction. After that, I went to the self-checkout area and started scanning my items. It was busy, with all the registers in use and a line forming behind them. While I was nearly done, I happened to notice the same man from earlier standing in the checkout line. He was behind another customer and somewhat hard to spot in the crowd, but I was sure it was him. This seemed strange to me since he had told me he still had more shopping to do, but I brushed it off, finished my checkout, and left the store. After loading my groceries into my car, I drove home as usual. The drive was uneventful, and I arrived back home about 10 minutes later. I went inside, unpacked the groceries, and put everything away. About 5 minutes after I had finished, I happened to look out the large front window in my dining room, which faces the driveway and the street. I noticed a car driving down the street. My neighborhood is usually quiet, so seeing cars drive by isn't constant. I watched casually, not thinking much of it until the car turned into my driveway. This immediately confused me. I had no idea who it could be. The car parked, and I stayed near the window, about 5 feet away, watching as the driver's door opened. To my shock, it was the same man from Walmart. He got out of his car and started walking up my driveway toward the front door. Panicked, I quickly ducked down, unsure if he had seen me. He reached the door and knocked. I was too creeped out to answer and stayed where I was. After a moment, he knocked again, but I didn't move. I didn't want to risk him spotting me. After about 5 minutes of silence, I cautiously got up to see if he was still there. He was no longer at the front door, but then I noticed him standing by another window, looking inside. Terrified, I ran out of the room. At that point, I was prepared to call the police if he tried anything like breaking in. A few minutes later, I returned to check, and thankfully, he was gone. His car was no longer in the driveway, and I finally started to feel relieved. I haven't seen him since, but the whole situation still unsettles me. I have no idea how he figured out where I live. He must have followed me home without me noticing. I'm just grateful he didn't try to break in, but I can't understand why he came to my house in the first place.